Good afternoon. I'm Joy Fakis, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Vermont Humanities Council. I don't know about you, but my head is swimming. There's so much that we've taken in between yesterday afternoon and today. I hope you all have had a great and productive conference. Again, a great deal of thanks goes to the team at the Vermont Humanities Council. The staff has done an amazing job, and also tremendous thanks to the team here at UVM that have made everything go so smoothly. So thank you to all of them. And it is my great honor to introduce our last speaker of the conference, Virginia Heffernan. Virginia Heffernan is a journalist, critic, author, most recently of the book Magic and Loss, The Internet as Art, which is also the name of her talk today. She is a contributing editor at Politico, a co-host of Slate's Trumpcast podcast, and a columnist at Fast Company. Heffernan has been called America's preeminent cultural critic and a public intellectual for the 21st century. In 2002, she received a PhD in English and American literature from Harvard, where her dissertation was on financial dynamics in American novels. Earlier today, Heffernan explored the history, hopes, and the shortcomings of data optimization. Her topic this afternoon is the Internet, which she has called the great masterpiece of civilization, its form and function, and its sacred and profane qualities. Heffernan grew up in Hanover, New Hampshire, where she was a young and early user of live chat rooms that she accessed through the mainframe computers on the Dartmouth College campus. As an academic and a journalist, Heffernan has lectured and keynoted at, and believe me, this is an amazing list, Google, the Library of Congress, Oberlin, the New York Public Library, Princeton, Dartmouth, Ohio University, Harvard, Union College, NYU, the National Gallery of Art, and Boston College, as well as many other institutions. Ms. Heffernan will take questions at the conclusion of her talk. Please join me in welcoming Virginia Heffernan.
Thanks very much for having me here to this conference, which has been immensely interesting so far, and it's been great to meet a lot of you. My parents and one of my dearest friends are in the audience right now, so if I'm nervous or pretentious or whatever, it's them I'm trying to impress. When I hear my bio like that with so many sort of odds and ends in there, I think of my advice now for creating a #1 bestseller on Amazon, because Magic and Loss was a #1 bestseller because it was cross-listed in 2 categories, telecom and aesthetics. If you ever want to make a bestseller, get cross-listed in 2 subjects that never cross, because you will be the only book in your category, and thus you will be the bestseller in it for all time. So I want to start by telling a story from November 14th, 2017, Tuesday. On Tuesday, and I told this story earlier, and so forgive me to those who were at the breakout session, but I think it bears repeating, and it's such an interesting case study for some of the things I want to talk about today, and so recent that I'm gonna tell it again. You may have heard that there was a boycott of the coffee machine maker Keurig. Keurig also makes or owns Green Mountain Coffee, so it's dear to our heart here in Vermont. And let me tell you a little bit about how that boycott happened. Sean Hannity, the exponent and apologist for our president, gave at first a ringing defense of Roy Moore, the child molester in Alabama, and in response, there was pressure from viewers and American citizens for advertisers on Sean Hannity's show to withdraw their advertising. There was a long list of advertisers, but among them was Keurig, the coffee machine maker. There were others that came before it in the alphabet and after it in the alphabet, bigger companies, smaller companies, even Starbucks was part of it. But the only boycott we heard about was one that was Keurig's decision first to boycott Hannity, and then we were told the decision of Roy Moore supporters to boycott Keurig, the Keurig coffee machine. And not only did they boycott it, but there were videos circulating that so-called conservatives were so infuriated that anyone would back off Hannity's defense of Roy Moore, the child molester. Let's just remember how far this is. They were so angry that this coffee machine maker would back off Hannity that they took mallets to their coffee machines in their garages and smashed the machines, right, in anger. Those videos circulated along with a hashtag, Boycott Keurig, that for a while showed up everywhere. And even for those of you who are not regularly on Twitter, maybe some of you are pretty regularly on Facebook, this story circulated like what I've been thinking of as kind of secondhand smoke. Like it sounds familiar to you today, a few days later. It's not like you didn't necessarily read an article about it, you didn't see a hashtag about it, you didn't push the hashtag yourself, you didn't decide to boycott Keurig yourself, but something about that day, Tuesday, sensitized you to Keurig, to the Roy Moore story. And by the end of the day, locally, as I understand it, 7 Days did a bit of a story on this because, you luck out, any of you who've worked in local news, you luck out when you can connect Green Mountain Coffee to this national story of Roy Moore and the Trump base. I mean, who doesn't write that story? NPR did it a little differently. NPR did it in the way of telling the story and then letting us draw a deep intake of breath at who possibly would be so defensive of Roy Moore that they would boycott the boycott of one of Roy Moore's defenders. That must mean that there is a base, a formidable base of Trump supporters, of these outlaws and sexual assailants who we should, tremble before because they wield so much power over our imaginations. And that was the NPR story. So let me back up and say, to my mind, and now I've just heard that the teenage son of someone heard me talk about this earlier, is doing his own research on this. But my quick gloss is there was no boycott of Keurig. There was no widespread destruction of the machines. And there was no movement to boycott the coffee maker because, once again, they boycotted Hannity. Hannity supported Roy Moore. And Roy Moore, the child molester, deserves our ringing applause. So what happened as I traced it is that in the morning, and this happens on a lot of days, a small group of people were probably paid to make videos of themselves crushing up machines with mallets. The pictures of the videos look very similar of the guys. And the couple three I think that I watched don't mention Roy Moore. So they probably, maybe, just guessing, I would love for someone to report this out. Typically, they're paid somewhere between $100 and $1,000, probably given the machine, told to cut it up or hash it up, but not told why. Not told why. Because the videos are not propaganda for some kind of widespread boycott. They just are supposed to be evidence that white guys with short hair are in their garages doing this thing. So those 5 videos drop in the morning. And then the Boycott Keurig hashtag is promoted everywhere on Twitter, and it starts at a mysteriously early hour. And that's because if you look at a site I take very seriously, the securingdemocracy.org site, I talk about it a lot on my podcast, Trumpcast, and I talked about it earlier today. I'm pretty much a shill for them. Some Obama administration people, some people on the right and left came together in a project that is meant to do something I'll talk a little more about, but is meant to help ensure what's now called our cognitive security, CogSec. We have InfoSec, we have NatSec, now there's CogSec. Our cognitive security is being violated by very specific, and I hate to sound paranoid like this, but very specific operations designed to set the agenda of what we talk about and think about in the day, and even how we conceive the world, Trump's base, and so on. So what happened, where I found out about the Boycott Keurig hashtag, I looked at it in the morning. I look at this dashboard that Securing Democracy puts out every morning. It's a list of 10 hashtags. They call it the Hamilton 68 dashboard. A list of 10 hashtags that are sourced to influence operations, and in this case, Russian influence operations. As you know, the American internet and the internet in many other countries suffered a highly destructive blow, a cyber attack during the elections. And our information systems and social media was highly, highly compromised. Everything from Facebook to Google to YouTube cannot be counted on anymore to be organic information. In any case, Boycott Keurig after MAGA, hashtag Make America Great Again, that's always the first one this group pushes, every day. So you're looking at a Trumpite influence ops. They also push things you don't hear about very much, like small details to do with Syria, things to do with Ukraine, that are very important to this particular part of the Kremlin. So that's another way you know where it's coming from. Second on the list, Boycott Keurig. Second on the list. So in other words, this end started very early in the morning. So you get these 5 videos showing us that there are these far-right maniacs whose brains have been completely so co-opted that they will wreck their own expensive coffee machines to protest. And that's very exciting. And then you get this hashtag circulating. And then you get the mainstream media, NPR, telling us this story over and over again about this base that is, will not listen to reason, that, and you can imagine the consequences. We know the consequences. Ordinary Republicans are unlikely to gun for impeachment for fear of alienating Trump's base. This base might itself be an epiphenomena of certain information operations. And that's important for us in the humanities to learn to be able to read something like that, to read better than NPR reads it. When you hear conservatives are smashing their coffee machines, just go look at the videos and see if they look like conservatives. See what you think of the word conservative. See if it's confirming your idea that there are a bunch of monsters in Alabama who will do anything to stand behind Roy Moore. And correct for that desire to have that confirmed. So that's, I don't mean to sound too ominous. My talk on the internet used to be very lively, all about how Instagram was a lot like frescoes in the Renaissance. But then, and it was very heartwarming. Unfortunately, Trump was elected. The desolation of Smaug befell us, and now I talk in a slightly different way. Magic and Loss, The Internet as Art, shows how 5 classical disciplines in the arts, design, music, poetry, performance, and painting, and performance, as it was known in Greek times, is now known as YouTube. They didn't have the broadband you might have expected them to have in ancient Greece. The Athenians really worked on it, but they didn't get there. And then painting on the internet means photography, including Instagram, and the effects of Photoshop on realist photography. So these disciplines, I argue in the book, persist in defining our experience of digital life. And for all we believe the internet is something apocalyptic and new, the book argues that it's an extension of the building blocks of civilization that I just described, a symbolic order that, like all symbolic orders, is better read, as we do in the humanities, than lived. So each chapter of the book, each section of the book on each of these disciplines shows the magic associated with new developments in what I call the digital arts, the building blocks of the digital civilization that I do think is itself a masterpiece and comprised of these artifacts that I describe in the book. So I talk about the design of websites and apps, the movement away from the urban confusion of a site like Yahoo to the clean apps like Uber and Seamless. That's the design section. It has a lot of partakes of urban history, architecture. I use most of the methodologies that I learned as a literary critic. The music chapter traces the evolution from vinyl and live music to the MP3, the sound of MP3s on our iTunes. MP3 music, my experience with iPods when they first appeared in 2001 generated the idea of loss. It's a term of art from engineering. Some of you may know that when the sound signal is compressed, the big, broad, muddy, bassy sound of vinyl is compressed to the sound signal on MP3s. It's often called a kind of lossy compression, loss-filled, lossful. Something is lost in doing that. Now, there's a board of people that tells us nothing's lost and that you can't hear the difference, and that in blind taste tests, no one can tell, Schubert on vinyl from Schubert on an MP3, or no one is missing anything. But a feeling that I'll come to later, that Freud described as the uncanny, tends to haunt the experience of people with very good hearing when they're exposed to MP3s. I remember around 2001, I suffer from some ear problems and hearing loss, and I went to my otolaryngologist, who himself has wonderful hearing that he never fails to gloat about when I see him. But he was crushed, and that music he felt in earbuds, the Franken sounds that he got from his small iPod, were not as satisfying to him as the jazz he could listen to otherwise. And I heard a lot of people describe this feeling of being in the music. Something was wrong with a little device that had so many songs in it, and something in the experience of it, something in the earbuds, something in the relationship of hearing to meaning making had been compromised by the MP3. So that's where I get the word loss in the title. As I say, I also talk about the fresco look of Instagram photos. The magic in the title is also a term of art from technology, in this case from programmers. So a magic program is one that makes a very, very complicated, magic software makes a very complicated operation, say something that involves licking stamps or going to the post office or all kinds of other analog things, or just a lot of code, look very, very, very simple. So we heard a little bit of a discussion of Uber last night, just the enormous things that deceptively simple Uber app is doing with using GPS technology, using signals, using all kinds of forms of intelligence gathering. Even apart from its business model, it's a magic-looking app. So often when you have that experience of delight with the internet, you're experiencing something that and technologists call magic. It's a big Steve Jobs word also. So the book's reviewers, the reviewers of Magic and Loss, called me an optimist. I'm about to tell you why I'm not anymore. Oh, good, I'm glad this is still there. Okay, you may be familiar with a sort of East Coast, West Coast battle between a kind of East Coast pessimism around digitization, sometimes rooted in our unwillingness to lose our totems, universities, cut down to adjuncts, humanities departments being shrunk in favor of STEM. I'm trying to think of things dear to all of our hearts. The publishing industry being hurt by people not reading, by the internet. Journalism, which I come from, obviously newspapers and dire trouble magazines. And so there were a lot of hand-wringing articles written on and books written on the East Coast just about the time that PowerPoint presentations were being pumped out on the West Coast, talking about a kind of techno-utopia, that all our problems would be solved by this kind of free technology. And I fortunately have been treated to both of those arguments. While I was in the English department at Harvard, I sorely missed the computers that I had enjoyed when I was a child and a teenager in Hanover. the mainframe computer and the time-sharing system that was alluded to earlier. I missed it, and so I tried to find someone in the Harvard campus that was using the internet, which was very young then. The web was very young then, and I found Jonathan Zittrey, and I completely lucked out. He was a 2L, a second-year law student, who was a sys-op at CompuServe. I was a mere user at CompuServe, but he was a systems operator, sysop. And having grown up with sysprogs, an earlier name for them at Dartmouth, I was very inclined to think that anyone with sys in their title was like a rock star. So Jonathan had started this thing called the Cyber Law Seminar. He was a very young law student, and he went on now to run the center that the Cyber Law Seminar turned into, the Berkman Center for the Study of Internet and Society, I think is the name of it. In any case, while we were at this first cyber law seminar, Harvard was acting like Harvard, like we're the governors of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was like, well, the internet has now appeared, so we're here to govern it. Well, let's make some laws about it. And I remember at the law school, they actually sat up high on the thing, and it was like Lawrence Tribe and Alan Dershowitz and like just all these gods. And I really took it seriously. I thought, and one of their concerns, and this is to speak to the techno-utopianists, they had people come in because they were now willing to entertain people who'd been working on the internet for a long time. So that meant the hippies. So they had people like the Grateful Dead lyricist John Perry Barlow, who was responsible for an idea that still informs the internet, which is, any of you who ever, excuse me, followed the Dead or had friends who did, know that the Dead's innovation was to give away their music and make it back on merchandise. So anyone could record the music. Anyone at a concert could record the music, make so-called bootlegs of the concerts. But how were they going to make money if they weren't going to sell records? They made it on T-shirts, mugs, and so on. Some people say Amazon works this way. You go, you stick to all this content and reviews and stuff, and you incidentally merchandise your experience of the text by buying 2 vacuum cleaners. I've done that. I decided I would go in to read reviews of vacuum cleaners and then accidentally buy with 1 click. 2. One was a steam mop, which is very good, actually. So that was one of the arguments at Harvard, was that there were all kinds of expressions in those days, some of you may remember, that getting information from the internet is like drinking from a fire hose, and impossible to get a breath, to get a full gulp, to register that your thirst has been slaked. This is still a problem with the internet. And another one was, because we were very worried, or they were very worried in those days about censorship in places like China, and so the other saying was, these are all civil libertarians, that in cyberspace, the First Amendment is just a local ordinance. I mean, I found these 2 expressions, they've still guided my understanding of the internet, and I must have heard them in 92 or 93. So I had those 2 views, that that information wanted to be free. Was the other thing that people in journalism sorely regretted ever saying, because by free, people soon took that to mean not liberated in the grit way of Berkeley and the ACLU, but free like nobody pays you. And I've had some dark years as a journalist and can say that information that I make wants to be expensive. But no one seemed to get that memo. So we had these, so I saw that split, and a split that I would one day sort of come to take into myself, between people who really thought the internet would wreck everything and those who thought we would be set free by it. By considering it the masterpiece of civilization, or itself a civilization, I'm not being utopianist. I think that was sort of a mistake. Civilizations, and cases in point include Rome, are not all good. And for that matter, art is mostly doggerel. So to say that Twitter partakes of certain poetic traditions or has, a prosody attached to it is not to say that it is all Emerson, that it is all, that it's all beautiful. In fact, most of it's not beautiful, but that doesn't mean that it can't be read with the methodologies of literary criticism. So even though I was supposed to, some critics, a reviewer said that, I was this peacemaker between West Coast and East Coast because I had a traditional education, but I have done a fair amount of work in Silicon Valley, including in amoral fields like branding. I'm not sure that that was completely right. I did advocate for the internet in my column in the New York Times for a long time. I was told that my job was to explain things very patiently, to always, they say, a doctor in Scarsdale. Think about a doctor in Scarsdale. So I tried to picture this doctor in Scarsdale when I was writing. But doctors are really smart, so I didn't want to condescend to him. But, in those days I had to say, every time I said YouTube, a clearinghouse of online video. Like, there was no way not to define it. We couldn't say tweet. We'd say, like, a short missive on a microblogging platform. But I came to realize that any kind of sort of Bolshevik spirit I had had for the internet, any kind of idea that the internet was going to save us, or all that had to happen was certain people who resisted it and who kept droning on about the moldy books from libraries that they were weeping over. I was so mean then. That they would suddenly, all their nostalgia would, fade away, and they would come to enjoy the raptures of the internet that I had first experienced as a kid and continued to love. Well, instead of me convincing them, they convinced me. And I started to see that there were things that I was beginning to miss too, and what's more, as social media appeared and YouTube appeared and began to get closer and closer, and this is where I'll get to the uncanny, to where the word friend, say, on Facebook, stopped being used in quotation marks and started being used as a way to actually invoke the loving relationship of two people who know each other intimately, I started to feel squeamish about the relationship between online language and the language that, that we grew up with, or even the heightened language known as literary language and poetry. And that's when I first got sensitized to something that people with a greater allergy to the internet experienced before I did. And that is a sense of the uncanny, which is embodied in those three figures from the Polar Express, but I'll get to them. All right, so in YouTube's earliest days, beginning of what's called Web 2.0, people were still blowing up Diet Coke with Mentos. That was one of the big spectacles of early YouTube. Responses to the site's curious videos tended to fall into two categories: astonishment and skepticism. First, in the comments would come these sort of huzzahs. I remember this one shred guitar video I talk a lot about in the book from 2006. The first responses to it were, "Better than Hendrix." Then that first commenter would usually surrender to the spectacle. That's sort of the me. I tend to like a spectacle, and I am willing to suspend disbelief about it in order to enjoy it. But somewhere down in the comments come forensics. So first you get this is amazing. Maybe sort of like our response to the Keurig thing. I can't believe these idiots ruining their machines, but this is so interesting. I'll talk to everyone about it. Forensics come down later. Look at minute 1 seconds 14, another wrote of the same video. It's not in sync. He's not really playing. In 2007, Wired, where I've written about the uncanny, published a piece called Why I Hate YouTube Google Video. Anyway, it doesn't matter, but they were merging entities then. And this piece took aim at an innocuous video that showed a man counting to 1,000. All he did was count to 1,000 in the video. No one made you watch it, but in those days they were curios. This was the review in Wired. "This disgusting mouth breather will make you want to choke the life from him," argued the piece. A virtuoso expression of fearful resistance to YouTube, which at the time seemed poised to choke the life from the whole internet. The same anxiety turned contempt attends much of today's social media, notably Twitter and Snapchat, where the sheen of fatuousness, the cryptic UX, and the clubhouse jargon appears designed to humiliate and enfeeble us. Anxiety is much more than a rookie response to internet-born humiliation and weakness. Sometimes it seems like the animating principle of the entire commercial web. It's worth pointing out that the web, so www, is actually a very small part of the whole internet. But it's the commercial part, the part they can sell ads on. Anxiety and consumers use. Anxiety is much, yes, so that anxiety is part of the reason for our decades-old retreat to apps, where McModern design and the illusion of walls seems like a hedge against the malware and rabble of the original web metropolis. Lots of people brought to digital technology only when it turned to apps, only when they didn't need to look at the junky non-design of Yahoo and early YouTube. But if you leave standard consumer software aside, you'll find that straight panic haunts the latest phase of digitization. And this is where we move out of the consumer stuff. Virtual reality, AI, the blockchain, drones, cyber warfare. These things spike the cortisol in everyone, but power users of GitHub and people with PGP session keys in their Twitter bios. If not, that doesn't mean anything to you, it shouldn't. Those are very arcane practices by hackers. The recent obsession with, say, whether Barack Obama and James Comey did the right thing when confronted with evidence of Russian cyber attacks in 2016 misses the point. No one, no world leader, no FBI director, no master of a subreddit knows exactly what to do about cyber attacks. The word alone is destabilizing. Closer to home, I can't even think about Bitcoin lately without suffering the vapors. I thought of this last night. If only I had taken the time to listen to that Bitcoin ranter on Acela 7 years ago. I'm not kidding. He told me he'd buy me $5 worth of Bitcoin. I didn't really even know what it meant. I'd have $4 million today. I mean, this was no joke. $5. So clearly I've been excessively cautious with cryptocurrency, but I've been spectacularly undisciplined in other areas of my digital life, leaving my phone and laptop eminently hackable. I have too many apps running in my brain's background, overheating it. What other opportunities am I missing then, or flanks am I leaving unguarded? This cycle of doubt and self-doubt, Bitcoin sounds fishy. I'm an idiot for thinking Bitcoin sounded fishy. It can turn palpable and somatic, physical. And that's when it starts to seem clear that what we're doing with software is not just interacting with machines, something our emotionally detached left brains can deal with. What we're doing still after all these years is seeking serviceable metaphors that will make sense of the digital onslaught, trying to match its many facets in scale and tenor with traditional human experiences. Of course, every metaphor carries its own baggage. I know there's at least one post-structuralist in the room, so shout out to you. For example, maybe Bitcoin is money. That's an okay metaphor, right? Maybe some way we might describe it. By the way, if you don't understand Bitcoin, neither does anybody else. I asked the head of the MIT Media Lab to explain Bitcoin. We were on a panel together. And he said, oh, it's very simple. Programmers find inefficiencies in code. So let me back up. You have code, it's the inefficiency. So that's Bitcoin. He didn't know what he was doing either. So maybe Bitcoin is money. Money surfaces, feel it in yourself, feel that word money, all kinds of emotional chaos surrounding credit, debt, thrift, riches, banks, and bankruptcy. Or maybe Bitcoin is a weapon. When we were at Harvard, some of the Massachusetts Bay Colony governors were trying to say that the internet might be governed by the Second Amendment and not the First. It might be considered a kind of arms. Maybe Bitcoin is cult esoterica. I mean, I'm not sure there are a lot of Bitcoin investors in the room. Maybe there are, but I get the sense that most of you think Bitcoin is not for you. It's cult esoterica, like a video game. Maybe it's, but when I have $4 million, will you think it's so trivial? Maybe it's the dark internet. Maybe it's benign nonsense. But with any of these hypotheses comes a set of associations, aversions, and attractions. At the same time, metaphors are poor things that never adequately illuminate the things they stand for. We're practiced in the old connections, from glittery gold to paper dollars to all that money connotes. But connecting Bitcoin to good old coins, the minted ingots used by our grandpas and ancient Romans alike, is a taxing mental operation. To put it simply, much of digital technology seems to be, in the words of that YouTube debunker, not in sync. It doesn't quite track. Twitter emotion doesn't rise and fall the way human emotions do, where we maybe go like this. We don't know what we do in nature now because no one's off the internet. But let's say we went like this. Twitter goes like, shh. Similarly, death, which is final by definition, is not final in Super Mario Odyssey, one of the best books about online games, about gaming, video games, is called Extra Lives. The fact that you have life after life, not ball after ball as in pinball, but that you get another life in the game, is part of what's so uncanny and odd about video games, the immortality of it. GPS technology is not true to the temperature and texture of physical landscapes. My editor at Wired said, but GPS technology does capture the landscapes. And then I reminded him that the three-dimensional world also has temperature, texture, smell. He had forgotten about those things, as many of us do. Alexa of Amazon's Echo sometimes seems bright, sometimes she seems moronic, but of course, she's neither. She's not even a she, and it's a constant category error to consider her one. Living in the flicker of that error, interacting with a bot as though its sentiments were sentiments, is to take up residence in the so-called Uncanny Valley, home to that repulsion we feel from robots that look a lot like, but not exactly, look a lot, but not exactly like us. And that phenomenon was identified nearly 50 years ago by robotics professor Masahiro Mori. What he pointed out is that we have no problem with industrial machines and robots. They can go on their way. We don't identify with them. We don't worry about them. We don't fall in love with them. We don't hate them. And we also have no problem with teddy bears, because teddy bears, they have 4 legs. They have a face. They look kind of like us, but you don't mistake them for us. They're so cute. They're great. We have warm affinity for them. But when you get something, Polar Express is always the example, that looks almost like us, but not exactly, you fall into what Maury called the uncanny valley. So affinity is going up, and more the robot looks like you. More and more the entity looks like you. And then right before it looks exactly like you, like a human that you could marry, you fall into this uncanny valley. And it's not just a thought experiment. The result of that uncanny valley is a result that, or the inhabiting that uncanny valley is something a lot of us who've tried virtual reality have experienced, which is nausea. Nausea is the physical reaction. And that nausea, that profound dysphoria, but not lethal dysphoria, not measurable dysphoria, it's very hard to find nausea in the body, induces this kind of fear and loathing. People call it creepiness. This is a fairly early CGI movie where it was believed that this guy especially really missed the mark of verisimilitude so much that the movie was entirely creepy. You maybe have to see him animated to get the full effect. So Maury used this notion of uncanny valley to describe a pretty restrictive aesthetic response to robots. But it's my sense, and it's in a way the argument of this talk, that the internet, by aiming to represent a monstrous range of human experiences that include everything from courtship to commerce to finance to war, induces a near constant dysphoria. An uncanny experience registers like a bad note to someone like perfect pitch. And all of us have perfect pitch for life itself. So I've worked with VR companies before. A friend in the room is working with one now, and one of the problems with virtual reality, and they keep thinking they can solve for the nausea problem or the dysphoria problem, which is usually measured in how quickly people want to get out of the headsets. And one of the ways that they quantify the thing that causes nausea and unhappiness in people who use VR, they call it latency. Latency is things move in virtual reality not quite right. And latency, I think, reduces the problem, but what it is just that there's some drag, like certain drugs produce it too, like trailers on things, so that like the motion is just, anyway, it produces this idea that something's kind of wrong in the world. That MP3 feeling that like there's something not deep enough, there's something not warm enough, but anyway, the physics of it aren't working right. I'll tell you another story about this. Paul Debovic, who's the sort of premier creator of digital humans, he was responsible for reverse aging Brad Pitt in the Benjamin Button movie. Very, very realistic digital replications of people. He did a digital portrait of Barack Obama, the first ever. He's not animated, but it's perfectly three-dimensional, and most people think it looks just like him. He's also made, with the Shoah project, with Steven Spielberg's project, he's made Holocaust survivors in digital human versions of Holocaust survivors whose voices are then recorded telling their stories, so that later they can tell their stories to kids and people who want to learn about their experience. But you can also, to make them answer specific questions, splice the words and make their mouths move because they know what they look like while they're saying all the letters and sounds. What could go wrong, right? I leave that to your imaginations, but it's certainly courting the uncanny. One more thing that Paul explained to me that I think is very interesting is that when we think we're reading faces, just human-to-human faces, we're actually only reading a tiny percentage of the data a face gives off. So anything that could be reduced to an emoji is, the way you might say she was smiling when I came in. But in fact, our eyes, because we're so familiar with human skin and faces and the shape of way faces look, because it's so, to all of us who can see, it's such a primal set of shapes, that we're taking in things that physics can't even track yet. One of the things he said is that our faces have a chessboard problem to them, which is that each millimeter, micron of our skin has some quotient of oil and hair and refracts and reflects light differently than every other place on our face, and certainly different from every other place on everybody else's face. And so those all have to work together. Like these are just entirely opaque skin, right? But there's a lot of randomness in the way the lines play off against each other. And then on top of that, it changes with your own blood flow and sweat quantities and so on. And then it changes again with motion, temperature, air. So this is not something that computers are great at capturing, all those factors, and yet humans are very good at taking them in each other and seeing, sensing a little blush or a little pallor in another person's face or flicker in their eyes. So that's the perfect pitch I'm describing, is just the way that we sit with each other and see each other's faces. I will say just another funny thing is I just heard a lecture recently on the aesthetic called the glabrous. It might be known to some of you in art history. The glabrous is hairlessness, and it's the aesthetic you see on marble statuary and in any kind of very hairless aesthetic. Sorry to mention this, but she brought up pornography. She said this is a very Johnny Ive, a very Apple aesthetic, that to have no hair on it. And I had thought to myself about Johnny Ive's aesthetic. One of the first things he wanted the phone to be and the iPad to be was oleophobic, afraid of oil. It just occurred to me that basically Apple thinks all of our human excretions and hair and irregularities are just revolting. So On the other hand, when you submit to this hairless, oilless, oil-free, oleophobic aesthetic, you end up with this. And that's where it registers to someone like a bad note to someone with perfect pitch. If you met someone with no oil in their skin, it would sit uneasily with you. Bad notes like this are everywhere on the internet. There's sort of queasy-making GIFs, nonsense autocorrect, something very unsettling when, for instance, I wanted to say I've had a couple sessions at the gym and it corrected to sessions like Jeff Sessions. And I just was like, that just ruined the next few minutes. All right. These memes suggest to me kind of broken minds, including my own. And the digital artifacts produced on Facebook, Instagram, and Spotify are identifiable as conversation bodies and guitars, and yet they don't sync with these things in three-dimensional space. Excuse me. Our bodies absorb the dissonance. And our brains work overtime to harmonize it or explain it away. So sometimes it increases our cognitive load to take something like Sessions to Jeff Sessions. Suddenly I'm looking at him. A friend of mine calls him Blanche Dubois. I don't know why I think that's so funny. All right. So now I get to bring up a friend of mine who's in the room. Consider my stock response to my friend Lorraine's honey-colored Instagram photos that showed her over the summer on a yacht in Corsica. She doesn't always do this. I'm not, I don't want to, anyway. Is that what life is supposed to look like? Why does my own life, I thought over the summer, by this loud municipal pool look sort of, but not really like that? Now, we rightly call this jealousy, and jealousy, people have noted, is a big effect of Instagram and Facebook for people. But the comparison of one's multi-sensory experience to a heavily staged photo passing for existence entails cognitive discomfort, too. My poolside afternoon changes millisecond to millisecond. It also has a horizon line, robust, unsweetened audio, no post-production. My daughter was yelping Marco, Polo, and pool glee sound. A start and stop breeze was around me. The scent of a nearby grill, little burning scent, ever-changing and infinitesimal shades that elude pixelization and suggest even hues outside the human spectrum that my sunblock, scented to evoke the tropics, I was in New Hampshire, is meant to guard against. What's more, because it was my experience, this scene is also inflected with proprioception, the sense of my own swimsuited body present in space. Compared to this robust and fertile experience as a mammal on Earth, isn't it the Instagram image that's thin, dry, and inert? The imagined object lacks the vivacity and vitality of the perceived one. That's philosopher Elaine Scarry in her book, Dreaming by the Book. I should say that Professor Scarry taught me at Harvard, and she was, I'm hearing that it's time to turn to questions. I'm just getting so, I just like talking to you so much. Elaine Scarry, I was once giving an analysis of Ode to a Nightingale that I'm sure was very not informed, and she said, she stopped me because I was talking like, I don't know, about deconstruction or something, and she said, Virginia, have you ever heard a nightingale? And it occurred to me that I just thought a nightingale sounded like any New England bird that I couldn't tell apart one from the other. And apparently they don't. But anyway, she said, I want you to stop talking until you've heard a nightingale. Because in her mind, perception and imagination are totally different. One is rich and beautiful and robust, and the other she always describes as thin and inert, the imagined object, which is a very unromantic view of the imagination. I'll try to wrap up soon. So there's this tile-sized cluster of pixels on my phone, this painting, let's call it Woman in Corsica on Instagram. I'm unaccountably afraid. And at the root of the anxiety of that moment was, who's the human here and who the simulacrum? The good news is that the anxiety of the uncanny is nothing new. Every single realist form that claims to hold a mirror to nature has made beholders panic, So in the 5th century BC, the Greek artist Zeuxias is said to have painted voluminous grapes that looked so much like the real thing that birds trying to eat them pecked themselves to death. Novels, which were intended to show unfiltered middle-class life in everyday prose instead of fakey verse. We have to remember novels were this middle-class form. They were supposed to be very easy and readable, not even as hard as like a Netflix show, honestly, like a primetime network show. These novels were supposed to have driven women to promiscuity because they represented their feelings so exactly. So women would just be overcome with how accurately they were represented in this, that they would go out and enact some of the lascivious misdeeds of the heroines. And of course, there's the famous Paris Stampede in 1896 when audiences watching Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat retreated to escape the train that was hurtling toward them from the screen. Now, none of these stories are true. They're all folklore. You can look on Snopes. But we like stories that suggest experiences with art and entertainment that we now take for granted once overwhelmed our ancestors. And I think that's because we know that we are developing a brilliant mechanism for telling reality from artifice, and it's an old one, and it's called literacy. And I think that's partly why we're here. Skillful readers of novels, I'm sure I'm in trouble by now, but recognize language as a symbolic order with rules that set it aside from the disorder of real life. Musicians recognize sound signals as different from tubas and vocal cords. And similarly, the Instagram image of Corsica is not life itself, it's not even Corsica, it's software. But we forget this over and over. Our eyes are still adjusted to the augmented reality of everyday life, mediated by texts and images on phones. The internet has grown too fast with the highest aspirations to realism, so much that we can't tell a boycott from a fake boycott, we can't tell fake news from real news, and I include myself in this. No one has developed guidelines for reading the internet without getting subsumed in it. Our phones even intercede between ourselves and the world, like last year's Pokemon Go. Visual artifacts now embellish everything, and the enchantment they cast is potent. They capture our minds. David Kessler's written about mental illness that one of the problems is that you get captured by the things that you think. One thought will hold you prisoner. If you encounter a troll online or a terrible doxer, it's not like watching a sitcom. You can't be fun and like you're reading a poem. It's a bruising personal affront. If you read the words, "You're an ugly fool" by @WillyWombat14 with your home address, try not to have your face flush and heart pound as if you were cornered by a thug in a dark alley. But you don't cool your anxiety by staying off the internet. Instead, you refine your disposition to it. Looking at a screen is not living, and the trick to reading technology is reading it, not being captured by it, maintaining the whip hand. Paradoxically, framing the internet as a text to be read, not a life to be led, tends to break without effort its spell. Conscious reading is a demanding ocular and mental activity. I assume this is a room of readers, and yet reading is not something you fall into like a warm bath. It's something you rise to. A demanding activity that satisfies specific intellectual reward centers, and it's also a workout. At the right time, your brain's sated, a reader tends to be starved for the sensory, bodily, three-dimensional experience of mortality, nature, textures, and sounds, and flees from the thin gruel of text. So imagine, Twitter does not resemble a real mob any more than a teddy bear resembles a grizzly. If you really go nuts and nuzzle up to a teddy, I guess you could swallow a button eye, but you're not going to get mauled. Tell this to your poor, rattled central nervous system as many times a day as you can remember. Make it your mantra. Throw away your anxiety medication, because nothing on your phone alone can hurt you more than a teddy bear. Thank you. Do we have time? Do we have time? Yes? Okay. I think there are microphones traveling around for some questions. I don't mind those long comment questions either. I know some people don't, but I don't mind someone just going on and on. Fun. Like I just did.
First, thanks. Wonderful, wonderful talk.
Oh,
So you end with a call to literacy.
yeah.
And I'm with you, but literacy needs to be taught, right? You know, we have kids, we know that they don't come out being able to read. So typically you have parents and educators who have the literacy toolbox to be able to teach the next generation how to do this.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges is that it's not, to be able to read Twitter the way that you say, it's not about reading the words. It's about reading the system, which is designed to be invisible to us. It's designed, as you said earlier, with the Apple, you can't see what's going on behind the system. Yeah. So how do people who don't have literacy themselves teach another generation to have literacy? Yeah. Like what's the wedge to get in there?
Well, one of the ways that, and I'm not in this category, but one of the ways that some of my generation and older have insisted on literacy is just the accident of their being horrified by the internet. So opening up a big gap between themselves and constant Wi-Fi, or just looking at Twitter and being overwhelmed by it. And so making defiance the key to their reading, taking only monthly print magazines, so forth. I do think they're missing out on a lot, but I do think they keep the gap nice and wide between, and they don't mistake Facebook friends for real friends and so on. But that gap does tend to open naturally to people with some time on the internet. There's some structural things you can do, and I'll just say one quick thing that I've been thinking about is how we used to tell fake news from real news, which was where things sat on the newsstand. So there are just some architectural cues. So, for instance, the boy trapped in a refrigerator eats own foot headlines that used to be on the National Enquirer. You knew how to read that. Even readers of the National Enquirer knew how to read that. They knew that this was like an interesting, scintillating, funny thing to think about, but they didn't at the same time take it entirely into their belief system and act and vote on it. Similarly, their soap opera digest, I'm sure you write about TV, soap opera digest, which I think still exists, treats the mishaps of people on soap operas as though they were breaking news. So, I'm going to have to go back a long ways to remember the characters, but Laura divorces Luke or whatever, and as if it's breaking news. And our tabloids, like OK Magazine or In Touch, In Style, Life and Style, they take characters from reality shows and who are in their full makeup and then talk about their off-screen lives, which blend into their on-screen lives. So we're essentially reading about fictional characters, like Dickens readers, taking a little too seriously the characters in Dickens novels. But we know how to do that when we're at the checkout counter or when we're looking at a newsstand. We know that Soap Opera Digest it's different from the New Yorker, it's different from the New York Times, it's different from the Washington Post, and so on. Sometimes on different paper, it has a different palette. But Facebook, especially, has made it very hard to tell one from the other. You can't tell if you can't tell a Breitbart from an ad from the Washington Post, and it's designed to confuse you. There are going to be ways structurally that Facebook has promised to distinguish one thing from the other. We'll see how well that works. But we also, I think, will start shaking down. Like, I made the Keurig mistake the other day, I won't make it again. I have ways that you can think of the things you've endured already and let rolled off your back, I don't think many of us in this room decided that Sandy Hook was a farce or watched the images of Hillary Clinton montages of her to show her that she was at death's door. People became pretty good at that, so I think that, we try to outrun it. It's like it's a dance of death. I mean, for some reason, I'm brought in a lot to talk about ad blocking software and, the scourge of ad blocking software. Who doesn't like ad blocking software? People who want you to see all their ads. But who doesn't want to see ads? The people that want to get the stuff for free without having to see ads. So you have a pretty typical capitalist battle. Like someone's trying to confuse you to look at ads, and someone's trying to not be confused so they can keep their head. And I think encouraging the second person, the person wanting to avoid ads, propaganda, disinformation, to just keep his head, not lose your head. I mean, I've actually been surprised at how many really, brilliant, interesting people get completely confounded when it comes to the Facebook interface and just submit to it entirely. Which is kind of a long way of saying I don't know. I don't know what a digital literacy curriculum would look like. I think it would look more like a humanities curriculum than we think right now. We think it's very exotic, but a lot of it is, teaching people to respect, tolerate long words, long sentences, suffer a little bit of boredom and less hyper-arousal. I talked earlier about racist material being about as hyper-arousing as pornography, and probably should be regulated that way. Teaching a tolerance for frustration and boredom is teaching, and then just in the near term, teaching like really great demanding books and encouraging what it looks like to sit and read a book. How often do you get up when you're reading a book? We don't have to make it monumentally impossible. It was something people did and could get through a book a day. And we don't need to tell ourselves over and over again, it's so hard, I never read anymore. Just to increase your tolerance for boredom and frustration. Also modeling reading, keeping books on the shelves. Freakonomics has this great point that the greatest predictor of literacy in kids is not how much the parents read, but just how many books they have in the house. So you can buy those books in bulk and just put them up there. Never touch them, and you'll create a great novelist. Anyone else?
You were talking about the uncanny experience,
Yeah.
and I've been thinking about the experience of reading a book or a poem on a computer screen versus in your hands. So a lot of us who are teachers in the room really struggle with the medium that kids take in, or our students are taking in, the stuff they're reading. Anyways, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because I think for a lot of us in the room who grew up reading books, we're drawn to what we might think of as the uncanny experience of the reading you do on the screen. But anyways, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. The culture sort of can outwit us in some ways, and I used to talk a lot about ebooks and reading on screens, and then I was just with someone at Amazon, and he said, we don't even think about ebooks anymore. It's all about audiobooks. And, a shift to an auditory culture from a textual culture, from, a written language to spoken language is fairly typical for the evolution of language, that, we would suddenly want to listen to podcasts and audiobooks. And, now Amazon is publishing a lot of straight to audiobooks. And so I'm not sure we should get bogged down in any one thing. Sometimes, for instance, like the problem of reading on screens, and the problem of reading on screens is we didn't grow up with it. But the problem of but then we do a lot of grafting on information about why something's wrong with it. I saw us do this with everyone. We did this with television, which was, I guess my first love, or depending on where it fits. But I wrote about television for a long time, and just hearing people say the problem with TV is it gets us bowling alone. Problem with TV is jump cuts. They hurt your attention span. Problem with TV is commercials. Problem with TV is you sit down all the time. The problem with TV is it sets unrealistic expectations for a Leave It to Beaver life. And there were so many, and argued so emphatically that, as soon as or that the screen is overwhelming, or, nobody talks to each other around it, all of a sudden we walk around with this. So we're on our feet all the time. And now the worst thing is that we're walking while we're watching something, we should be sitting. So, or the smallness of the screen is the problem, where the bigness of the spectacle was the problem. So I'm not sure there's something intrinsically wrong about reading on your phone, is what I would say. I do think that we heard a lecture earlier about not reading. I think we are in a time of hyperlexia. I think as much as we complain about people not reading, we are reading so much that we will risk fatal traffic accidents to keep reading texts and writing them. Texts, the most elemental word for what reading is, interacting with text. If that doesn't look like, reading a Torah scroll or reading a codex or a novel by Marilyn Robinson, I don't think that then we should just call it not reading at all. Making the decision while driving not to read or while walking down the street not to read is one of the signature acts of literacy, that this is not the time for me to be reading and taking in words. So I think we should sort of interrogate what's wrong with reading on screens. I talked a little, I mentioned hairiness and the glabrous. There's a lot to the texture of the page that is sort of newly interesting, newly attracting the attention of people in pedagogy, teachers, professors. I just heard Marina Warner give a lecture on using hair and burlap and other fabrics to engage the sense of touch. And I think one of the things that people who love books, bibliophiles, miss is the slight roughness of the page. I'm not sure. Or sometimes the sunken ink, or a lot of people talk about the scent of which is a kind of mold in the bindings. That's not my jam, but Marina Warner has certainly made the case that that reintroducing, opening all the senses in the classroom is a good idea. I just wrote a piece about Google, and Google says it organizes all the world's information. It engages 2 senses. Can you imagine there's no olfactory component to a Google search, there's no taste, and there's no touch. Can you imagine in any other era, talking 2 out of 5 senses is how we take in all the world's information? We really have had our idea of what information is confined. And I don't know what a classroom with greater sensory involvement would have, but she teaches at the University of London, Marina Warner, and she has people go sit on the grass. She has them work with burlap while they're also reading, or read text written on interesting materials, including metal. I don't know. I can imagine, though, that there would be something very interesting and exciting about that. Anyway.
That'll be our final question.
Okay.
I wanted to make a comment and also ask a little more about your Keurig example that you started with.
Yeah.
It brings to mind that the whole idea of the relativity of truth on the internet and maybe in our culture now. But I was very interested to hear your description of your investigation. I consider myself, and I think many people here consider themselves fairly media literate. If I had not attended this lecture, I don't think I would have ever known the extent that you described of the strategies that went into creating that false news. And the fact that I don't recall where I heard it, whether it was NPR or someplace else, but it was in the back of my mind as representative of a sizable portion of the population having an opinion on the Hannity comment. So I'm struck by your statement of positivity and the fact that you're not pessimistic about this, because I sort of have the opposite reaction, that the fact that if I'm not here, I'm not knowing the extent of the subterfuge in that whole encounter, that literary encounter.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. As just a first measure of increasing your immune system, and by the way, my own immune system fluctuates. I made some mistakes I talked about earlier with the notion of Antifa, the anti-fascist movement. I, like a lot of people, incorporated that into a conversation that brought me very perilously close to comparing it to the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. And it took pulling some wires out of my head, basically, to try to get some distance on that. And the same terrible mistake was made by the president of Dartmouth College, who censured a writer that had gotten in Breitbart sites. Anyway, it's an elaborate story, but the point is it can happen to all of us. It really can. And our cognitive security, we haven't established antibodies for some of this misinformation and disinformation. And it really does happen to all of us. It happens to, it happens to all of us. But the first thing I'd say to do, which is just my absolute hack for this, is actually to write this down. Go to the Hamilton 68 dashboard. Hamilton 68. It's on a site called securingdemocracy.org, and unfortunately it's not very shareable, but you can look at it on the site. Every morning, they put up a list of things that influence operations, psychological operations want you to talk about. So I think of it as like an anti-newsletter. If a newsletter is supposed to tell you the news of the day, this is the anti-news. Don't talk about this. And a simple thing for those of you who use Twitter and Facebook, don't use hashtags. Hashtags are a wonderful way for people to search you, and they're also a wonderful way for you to ride on the madness of crowds. So for instance, something that could look simple, like take a knee or take the knee around the NFL controversy, sits side by side with NFL boycott that same day. Boycott NFL, NFL boycott, they find different versions of it. Because sowing discord, especially along racial lines, is something that Soviet intelligence operations have used since the Bolshevik Revolution, frankly. And so whenever you feel like, it might start with an uncanny valley sense of like, oh, Keurig's in the news. Why? Why would people smash their machines? It just doesn't dovetail. It's like that thing I described if we have perfect pitch for human encounters. Why would a group of people, unless we've decided that they're so alien to us that their brains are kidnapped, why would they possibly defend this child molester in such an odd way? Maybe sit with the idea that this is not real information. Visit this dashboard, look to see if the hashtag is on there. It's amazing how often it is. Even things, so for instance, is Al Franken as bad as Donald Trump, right? The conversation from 2 days ago. You look at the thing, Franken, Frankenstein, screw Al Franken, Franken, blah, 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 are the first 10. They're the second 9. The first one is always, just so you know who you're listening to, hashtag MAGA, make America great again. So it's Trump supporting, and by the way, the origins of all these organizations that push these hashtags are on there, lest you have any questions about it. This is not a Red Scare thing. They'll tell you exactly, who they're tracked to and what their methodology is. So you get a creepy feeling, you get an uncanny valley feeling around something that's just come up. Even maybe a relative of yours posts something that's just like, why now tell us about Hillary, some twisted thing about Clinton cash or whatever. Why is he posting that now? There's a lot in the news. There's a tax bill that's going to help people with private planes that might soon pass. There's a lot of other things we could be talking about, the weather, the whatever, but suddenly it's the day to talk about Clinton cash. So look on that dashboard and see, probably there'll be Clinton Foundation, Clinton cash, HRC sucks or whatever, and then you might know that this is an opportunity to have your antenna up. I wish I could do better than that, though. I find myself, and things go fast, and you find yourself in trouble, very quickly. It's also, frankly, it's not very fun to tell someone that they're having their conversation priorities set by Russian bots. When you first look at this thing, you're just like, oh, I can't wait to tell everyone that the debate they had about Al Franken last night was just because, Vladimir Putin is now in their brain. And then they're just like, yeah, I don't really want to believe that. Anyway, I hope I've left you with a few tools to relieving, and also maybe using your sense of the uncanny as an early warning system that, you need to become better and more empowered readers. Thank you.